All right, will you please open your Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 6? We continue our verse-by-verse study through the book of 1 Kings. The book of 1 Kings is an exciting book about the history of Israel, and yet within that, as with the book of Exodus, there are some sections that are just challenging because of the detail that are provided that don't necessarily translate to us. However, we can learn from every part of these inspired scriptures. God put them there for a reason. We'll go through them, and tonight we're going to learn a few things. So if your Bible's open, 1 Kings chapter 6, we're going to cover two chapters tonight. The title of the message is called Building the House of God. Now, before you accuse me, you come to church every week. We go verse by verse. This is where we are. Tonight they are building the house of God, and that's coincidence because we are going through a building, at least I wouldn't say building project. We're not building it, but we will be buying and repairing it, and these points will apply to us. But the title is called Building the House of God. And as I was doing my study and going through all these scriptures, I came across a story about a man who went to the pastor's house to let him know about a family in the congregation. And the pastor was taking a nap. His wife answered the door. And he asked for the pastor, and she said, well, he's taking a nap, but maybe I can help you with something. He says, actually, I was hoping to talk to you as well. And so he said, I just want to let you know that there is a family in the church that has really fallen on hard times. I don't know if you know it, but the father has had some medical issues. He had some chest pains, and he's unable to work. They're in really dire straits. Their oldest son is now sick. They don't have the money to take him to the hospital. And also, to make matters worse, their power is getting ready to be turned off, and their landlord is getting ready to put them out of their house. I'm just hoping there was something that you can do. And by this point, she's got a tear in her eye, and she's looking at him and saying, well, my goodness, I will see what we can put together, but who are you? Are you a family member? Are you a friend? He says, no, I'm the landlord. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? To think somebody would do that. What would you, if I would ask you, what would you say this man's priorities were? Well, without saying it, clearly his priorities in life are money, and apparently he has no moral basement, right, by which to get it. Seems like he would probably do anything, and of course we know that there are people in the world like that. We've probably run across some of these folks in our past that would, for the old saying, would step over a dead relative for $50. Money is a driving factor for many people. And I think if we're not careful, it can become a driving factor for us. There's an old saying that says you can always tell what your priorities are by following your checkbook. We don't really balance checkbooks anymore, at least I don't. But when you look at where your money goes, you find out what the priorities of your life are. And in fact, you find out what the priorities of a country are by what they spend money on. I looked at the top 10 holidays that money is spent. Guess what number one is? You would think it would be Christmas, wouldn't you? Back to school. Back to school is the number one holiday that people spend money on. You don't call it a holiday, but because of the retail industry, it has become a holiday. Back to school season. More money is spent going back to school. Why? Well, it's so that I can have new clothes, I can look good, I can be prepared. That shows where the value is. Number 2 was Christmas. Number 3 was Mother's Day. And number 4, then we finally get to Easter. So you see the priorities. Before we get into our study, we can ask ourselves, what does our checkbook say about us? What are our priorities in life? Well, as we look at this scripture here, we're going to see what the priorities of the nation of Israel were at this time. So chapter 6, picking up in verse 1, it says, and it came to pass in the 418th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So that is a lot of information in a run-on sentence, isn't it? What this is telling us, after Moses led the people out of Egypt, of course, Joshua led them into the promised land, and it says now they have been in the land for 418 years. And you say, now they're starting to build a house of the Lord. Yes, this is more of God's command than necessity, really. right? Because they had the tabernacle, and the tabernacle was sort of a mobile temple, if you will. It was a tent that had all the articles in it. They could pick up, they could move. And when it sat in one place in Shiloh for long enough, they built a foundation for it there. But it served the country as a place to come and meet God. It was a place where the priests went in and met with God on the people's behalf. Now it is time to build the temple. Solomon, King David's son, has been charged to do it. And he has the materials because at the end of David's life, he put together a lot of materials. And now the Lord is blessing it by giving him favor with Hiram, king of Tyre. And now he's getting all the best materials of the land. He's putting them all together. And we're told this is when they started building now the house of the Lord. It says, verse 2, now the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. And I don't know if you got a tape measure in cubits. Pretty unlikely. But it's somewhere around 18 inches. So we can look at this building. This is the main temple structure where the Holy of Holies was, and it had all the courts and everything went with it. But this is the main building. It was 90 feet long. It was 30 feet wide, and it was 45 feet tall. So it was a fairly good size building, extremely tall. It says, the vestibule in the front of the sanctuary of the house was 20 cubits long across the width of the house, and the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house. And he made for the house windows and beveled frames. Against the wall of the temple, he built chambers all around, against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary. Thus he made side chambers all around it. The lowest chamber was 5 cubits wide, and the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For he made narrow ledges around the outside of the temple so that the support beams would not be fastened into the walls of the temple. And the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. So don't fall asleep on me now, because this is really exciting blueprint building material. This is giving us the inside and sort of understanding of what the grandeur of this place was. So don't focus so much on the details when it's, giving us all this, and this is what, and they built this and built that. If you want to, go home, Google it. Some excellent pictures come up of what the temple structure looked like. You can even do an interactive little video and walk through it if you want to. It's kind of a neat deal. But there's a few details. There's something I just want to highlight from this that is especially interesting to me. It says in verse 7, when it was being built, it was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or iron tool was heard at the temple while it was being built. You know what's so interesting about that? Is when you go to Israel today, in fact, when we go next March, we're going to go and we're going to see the Temple Mount structure. And what we really look at is more or less the foundation of the temple. The temple stood on top of the mount, and from what we look at, a lot of this big foundation was actually set by not King Solomon, but later on it was King Herod, who built it out to his grandeur. But Solomon really started the whole thing, and some of these blocks you can still see today. But when you look at these stones, they're massive. And I mean massive. I mean, you couldn't fit them on the stage up here. Some of these stones, one of them is about the size of a bus. And when you see these stones, you think to yourself, wait a second, I think they had different standards back then for building. Because they had to send the dimensions of the stone to be cut at a quarry a ways away. And it had to be perfect. These stones fit together so tightly, you can't fit a dollar bill between them. So the plans had to get there. The message had to be sent, and then the one who cut it had to cut it perfectly because, it's not like you just Amazon these things, right? They cut these things, and then they have to transport these things to the site, and all they did was fit them into place. Now, this is so fascinating because of the detail, the level of detail. So if you transport this thing from the quarry to the temple, it had better be right. You're going to have a very angry contractor that shows up and said, I said 6 foot by 10 foot. You gave me 5 foot by 9 foot, right? Nowadays, I don't think this could be done because I rarely leave Taco Bell with it short of something. That's why I got to order so much. It just is fascinating when you see this, the amount of detail and what had to be done. And so they put these things in place. In verse 8, it says, the doorway for the middle story was on the right side of the temple. They went up by the stairs to the middle story and from the middle to the third. Now, when Herod rebuilt this, you can still see some of these stairways that are there today on the Temple Mount. So he built the temple and finished it and paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar. And he built side chambers against the entire temple, each 5 cubits high. They were attached to the temple with cedar beams. So they're putting these things together. He has hired these workers to put it all together. And then in verse 11, we shift gears for just a moment because it says, then the word of the Lord came to Solomon saying, concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, and keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David. And I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people. You know what I love about this? It seems because now we're reading blueprints essentially for how to build a temple of God. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, put that down, step over here, I want to talk to you. Without your obedience, all you're doing is building a building. What's really important to you and to me, to the builders that built God's house, was understanding that this house is not, it's not for God, it's for the priest to go to God on the people's behalf. But without that, without the presence of the Lord, by your obedience, all this is for naught. Do we get that? Because I think if we're building the house of God, and truly we're getting ready to enter into this thing ourselves, it's interesting, it's so fascinating that this is the time frame we're studying this passage, because we're getting ready to go in. And I feel like this is God speaking to us right now. Hey, you know what? There was a lot of excitement in Israel at this time. They were building a house for God. This was cool. And think about the fascinating thing. Everybody's getting to come together, and everybody's getting to, work and donate to the temple, and everybody was getting involved. There's a lot of people doing things for God. And truly, every time we do an outreach here, every time we do an Easter service where that requires a lot of manpower, it's fun. People get involved. Sometimes it's people for the first time. And what happens is people feel like, yes, I'm doing something and I have this sense of purpose and fulfillment. And truly, it's a great thing. And God is saying, that's good. But if you don't continue to obey me, then all this is for nothing. The building, the projects, the stuff, all of that's for nothing if you walk back into your old ways of life and completely forsake me. You know what's sad about this? It was only a few years after Solomon died that they were taken over by their enemies because they forsook God, and this temple will be plundered for the first time. Not destroyed, but plundered. Without the obedience, and this is what he's saying, if you obey me, this is an if-then promise. If you obey my commandments, you walk in my ways, you execute my judgments, then I will dwell among the children of Israel, and I will not forsake my people. The only time Israel got in a lot of trouble is when they forsook God, followed after other gods. Then they lost their temple, they lost their land, and ultimately they lose, some of them, their lives. Never happened when they followed and obeyed the Lord. And isn't that just kind of what we went through last Thursday? Obedience brings blessings, and disobedience brings consequences. If you drive the speed limit, guess what? The blessing is that you get to keep driving. You get from point A to point B in a vehicle of your choice, and you get to do that. However, you have the freedom to disobey, but you're not free from the consequences of your disobedience. You'll get speeding tickets. Eventually, you'll stand in front of a judge, and the judge will then decide you are not responsible enough to be on the roads here in our part of the country, and he'll take that license away. And then you can choose to obey again and drive without that license. And now you're talking about jail time, and see the consequences ramp up. And this is the same way that God deals with us. Do we slip up? Yes. Do we even transgress? Yeah. Right? And God slowly but surely removes his blessing from your life and allows some things to happen to show you, hey, this isn't the right way to go. You need to repent and get back with me. This is what it means to be right with God. And the beautiful thing and the blessing of all this is, no matter where you're at, you can always stop and you can always get right with God again. And you can get down on your knees and you can repent and you can say, Lord, please forgive me. I've done it again. Please do not take your presence away. Please fill me with your spirit and give me the strength to walk in your light. Wow. And God has that open for everyone. And he says, you obey me, it will be followed by blessing. If you disobey, I remove my protection. You walk out from underneath me and you end up with problems. It's such a simple way of looking at life, isn't it? Such a simple way of looking at life. And so when we are building the house of God, we must remember that only by following God's laws will we be blessed. And I just want to go backwards just a little ways to 1 Samuel chapter 15. And I want to read to you something else, that obedience is definitely better than sacrifice. This is 1 Samuel chapter 15. It says, Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore heed his voice and the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he has done to Israel, how he ambushed him on the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek, and listen to the instructions. Go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them. both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Okay? God's instructions, easy to understand. We can debate whether or not we like that or not, but if we go back and we look at why these instructions were given, it makes a lot of sense. These people were sinning. They were killing their babies on the arms of their gods. They were doing, it was just awful, awful, awful stuff. And God said it's time for it to stop. We must take them all out. It's time to wash it clean. It's time to take them out. And you're going to be the tool to impose these consequences on these people who will not follow and not heed and not listen. So now if you skip to verse 9, it says, "But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good, and were unwilling to utterly destroy them." Had they had the choice to obey, they chose not to. It says, "But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed." So in other words, if it was valuable, keep it. If it's not, kill it, right? Let's make the decision here. So this is what happens later on when Samuel comes to him and he calls him out. He says this in verse 21, "But the people took the plunder, the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." So Samuel said, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of the rams." In other words, it doesn't matter how much you sacrifice to me. If you're walking in disobedience, it doesn't matter. "For rebellion," verse 23 says, "is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. But you have rejected the word of the Lord. Now he has rejected you from being king." That was his consequence. Now we see the contrast. This is what he's setting forth before Solomon now, building the house of God, all the nation of Israel, and what I believe he's saying to us tonight. Hey, without obedience, this is all going to be for naught. You want the blessings of the Lord, you need to obey both in your own lives and as a church in the commandments that I have given you. So, now they have this warning in verse 14. "So Solomon built the temple and finished it. And he built the inside walls of the temple with cedar boards. From the floor of the temple to the ceiling, he paneled the inside with wood, and he covered the floor with the temple with planks of cypress. Then he built the 20-cubit room at the rear of the temple from floor to ceiling with cedar boards. He built it inside as the inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. And in front of it, the temple sanctuary was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with ornamental buds and open flowers. All was cedar. There was no stone to be seen. And he prepared the inner sanctuary inside the temple to set the ark of the covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. He overlaid it with pure gold and overlaid the altar of cedar. So Solomon overlaid the inside of the temple with pure gold. He stretched gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. The whole temple he overlaid with gold until he finished all the temple. Also, he overlaid the gold, the entire altar that was by the inner sanctuary. Inside the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the cherub was 5 cubits, and the other wing of the cherub 5 cubits, 10 cubits from tip of one wing to the tip of the other. So it's 15 feet tall, 15 feet wide. I'm going to give you kind of the without reading through the rest of these details, I'm going to give you sort of the idea here is that when you walked into the temple, you walked into a room called the most holy room. So even at the temple today, there's a place for Gentile or for women and then for Jews to pray. And they have a Gentile area. Back in these days, there were sort of these outer courts. You had the Gentile court, you had the court of the women, then you had the court of the Jew. Jewish males could go in there after they did the ritual cleansing. Then you had an area for the priests. Then you had a most holy area, and then you had what was called the Holy of Holies. Now, as you went in closer to where this Holy of Holies was, if you walked in, there was a seat, there was the room, and it was all gold. So that must have shined. And then upon this, over the seat, were these 2 cherub, and they're not explained in detail, but think of it as like angels with these massive wings, and they were on either side, and they were touching, one wing to the wall, and their wings were touching over the top. So it was kind of like protecting what was there. And then there you had the Ark of the Covenant, and then you had Moses' staff, and you had the Ten Commandments that were there. And so this was the place where they would go once a year to make atonement for the people of Israel. And so when you went in, well, you couldn't go in these days, but there was this big veil that separated it with gold chains around it to prevent people from going in there. And in fact, it was so holy that when the priests went in there once a year to do this rite, they actually attached a rope to him and bells, because only the high priest could go into this room only one time a year. And when he went in there to meet with the Lord on behalf of the people, if he had missed any of the steps of cleansing and all the steps that he had to go through in order to be washed and cleansed to go into the presence of the Lord, if he missed any of these, he'd die. And so they thought, well, if he dies, who's going to go in there and get him? Right? So they tied a rope around his waist and they put bells on him. So as he went in there, if the bell stopped ringing and he didn't come out after a while, they tugged on the rope and pulled out his body. I don't know if it ever happened, but that was at least according to Jewish tradition how they did things. But are you kind of getting an idea of how much gold and work and time went into this? He used the most, they quarried the stones, they brought them, they set them in place, and it was perfect. When they brought, the logs down from the cedars of Lebanon, this was the most expensive building material known to man, and he put it everywhere, so much so that it could have looked like a forest inside with these pillars and these boards that covered everything. And then they took gold and overlaid all the boards and all this. So if you walked in there, you're walking into a room made with gold. That would have been incredible, a sight to see, would it not? Now, I want to make a point about this, because as you look at this, you think to yourself, man, they really must have spent an awful lot of money. And truly, for the rest of the chapter, it really just more details on the temple itself, and it's really hard to picture. Like I said, go home and Google it. What did the temple look like? Solomon's temple, and there's some really cool, I'm a visual learner, so reading this is just sleepy time, right? But when I see it, it's like, wow, now I can kind of see it and I can experience it, right? And so I just want to make this point on this, is when you notice the materials they used, they gave God their best, didn't they? Right? Who was financing this thing? It was the people of Israel. King Solomon was wealthy. Why? Because they obeyed the Lord and his commandments, and God blessed the country. Was God blessed the country? They used that money and they built the house of the Lord. What materials did they use? The best stuff money can buy. They didn't go to Home Depot and find out what was on sale. Right? They didn't go to Walmart and find out what building materials are on the clearance rack. Okay, let's use that at the church. No, they did the best that they could do with the material, with the money that they had. And they had substantial means, and they gave God their best. He used the best wood, the best stone, and the best builders, and put gold on everything. Did you know that when the people made their sacrifices, that God said if they sacrificed a lamb, it had to be without blemish? Now you hear that and you think to yourself, why was that such a big deal? Why? Because the blemished lambs were considered less expensive, and they were not, if my daughter, when she was especially little, not now, but when she was really little, if she had two of something, and I would always go in and I wanted to use object lessons, right? That's what pastors do in their home. They're always looking for object lessons, right, for their kids. And I wanted to teach her to be a giver. And so I would sort of be the recipient. I'd go in and say, can I have one of those? And I remember when she was really young, she had these two dolls. They were identical, right? And one of them she played with more than the other, and one was fairly new. And then, it was just like, well, can I have one? And she, she knew, like the wrong thing to do is to say no, right? She knew that much. So she kind of felt maybe obligated to do something. And then she just looked at both doll, right? And one of them had like a blemish on it. I think the leg had broken off, and, he stuck it back on there or something like that. And she's looking at things, she's like, you can have this one, I guess. And, it was always kind of like, we talked through these things, and it was great. And ultimately, she would come around, she would sort of identify what I'm trying to do. But doesn't that just sort of show us, like, what's inside of us? Because kids are just adults that don't really hide their emotions very well, right? Why did she want to do that? Well, because this is the better one. I'll keep the better one for myself, and I'll give you one that's extra that I don't necessarily want. And I think sometimes that translates from our heart to our giving when it comes to the Lord. This is why they were supposed to, are you going to sacrifice a lamb? Don't give me the leftovers. Give me this, right? He says, do it this. When people tithed from their crops, they were to give their first fruits, the very first produce of the field. They gave their first fruits. It was really funny. We had a garage sale at a church that I was on staff with. This was I don't know, 12, 15 years ago. I don't know how long it was. But I was in charge of the garage sale and intake. So I was getting all the stuff. And I was like, wow. There was one person, and I do not want to put them down at all because this was where their heart was at the time. But they showed up and handed me this bag full of stuff and dust and cobwebs and dirt, right? And said, here, I was cleaning out my attic, and I don't need these anymore, so maybe the church can sell them. And I'm like, okay. I set the box down, I open it up, and it's like all this, it was like a collection of shot glasses. And like this big gold-looking gaudy beer stein. And I'm looking at it. I mean, at one part, it was kind of like this. It was a little bit endearing because it's like, I'm glad you don't need these anymore, right? I'm really glad that these are so dirty because clearly you've not been using these, right? But at the same time, it's kind of like, would you give God your old filthy shot glass? I mean, man, clean them up before you're going to bring them anyway. But I mean, is this what you have to give to God? Is this where your heart's at with God? Is this what he deserves in your life, your old filthy shot glass collection? You know, and I did have to kind of smile at me like, man, we're a church. I don't know if selling shot glasses is really something we're going to get. I don't think that's the business we want to promote here at, the church. And again, it was like she totally understood. And today she would probably laugh at it because I know this person has grown a lot in the Lord, but that's where they were at the time. But still, isn't this sort of emblematic? That sometimes what we do is we can take the best for ourselves, and then sometimes if we, have anything left over, it's like, well, I guess I don't need this. Maybe we can just give it to the Lord. Maybe the Lord can use it. No. Look at the temple. Look at what they did. Did they not give the Lord their absolute best? It shows where their priorities are, isn't it? In Europe, if you go to Europe, there's a lot of really old churches in Europe, big, massive churches. And the work that went into building these churches and the carving and all the stuff that they put into it and the windows, and then you go inside and there's all this stuff. When you realize most of those churches were built by people who were so poor, and you see that they lived in these poor houses, right? And then they built these beautiful dwellings for God, right? And you sort of see, it was like, well, clearly their priorities were there. So once again, it sort of comes down to, once again, we ask ourselves that question, what is our priority? And let me just kind of put it this way. When we give God our leftovers, what we're saying is thanks God for providing everything that I have, and I don't need this anymore, so I guess you can have it back. Kind of bottom line. When we put it like that, it doesn't sound very good, does it? But you can imagine if you have children, and if your children were to earn money, and they were to come to you and they were to say, Dad, you've given me everything I ever had and a place in this home, and you've never required anything from my hand. Here's my first paycheck. First of all, my heart would just burst open, right? Would I take it? No, probably not. Right? No, I don't think so I would. I mean, I was like, better make sure on that one real quick. But I mean, what would you do? You'd be like, oh, thank you, but I don't need it. I appreciate the gesture, and because you were willing to give it, that's wonderful. Now, here you go, right? And I think to do anything less than that really is to misunderstand where our blessings come from. How did we earn that money? Was it because we're so great, or did God give us the talent to do it? How did we, how do we operate? Well, we breathe His air. He doesn't charge us air tax. He could, it's His. And so they gave their best. So I'm going to skip the rest of this chapter. If you want to read it tonight as you're going to bed, feel free. There's a lot of interesting detail in here beyond that. But let's go ahead and go to verse 7. Verse 7 says, But Solomon took 13 years to build his house, and so he finished all his house. I'll back up one verse. In verse 38, it says, But in the 11th year, the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its details and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it. But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house, so he finished all his house. And he built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Now, remember the dimensions of the temple? The dimensions of the temple are, let me say what it was here, 60 cubits by 20 cubits wide by 30 cubits high. Now, what was Solomon's house? 100 cubits, 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits, and 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. And it was paneled with cedar above the beams that were on the 45 pillars, 15 to a row. There were windows with beveled frames in the rows, and the window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And all the doorways and doorposts had rectangular frames, and windows were opposite the window in 3 tiers. He also made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, its width 30 cubits, and its front of them was a portico with pillars, and a canopy was in front of him. Then he made a hall for the throne, a hall of judgment, where he might judge, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the house where he dwelt had another court inside the hall, and like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. So we'll read through the rest of the chapter in a moment, but I just want to sort of highlight something we just read here too. That Solomon made God the first priority. Did you notice that? He finished the house of God first, and then he built his own house. And you know, there's nothing wrong with having nice things. And whenever we talk about stuff like this, it's always a challenge to us where we feel like, well, man, maybe I shouldn't have anything. Maybe it should all go to God. And, you know, that's maybe perhaps a fair feeling of the heart to have. But I also want to mention, and I do want to say it, I'm not trying to justify anybody's greed, but what I do want to say is there's nothing wrong with having a nice house. Solomon had the money. Solomon took, after he finished the Lord's house, then he began to build his own house. And what we see is if the temple was nice, Solomon's house was nicer. It took 7 years to build the temple. It took almost twice that to build his own home. And then he built a home for his wife, Pharaoh's daughter. He built her a home as well. So he had some nice stuff, but nowhere is he really condemned for these things. And in fact, it may have taken longer to build his own house because of the massive commitment of people that were building the temple, right? He had a massive commitment of people building the temple, and his own house, he may not have used all that. We're not really given those details, but we are sort of seeing from Solomon where his priorities may have shifted a little bit. He had a taste for nice things, and perhaps he's not condemned by it, although it did lead him astray at the end of his life. But I just want to make this point because he built God's house first, and then he built his own house. And that's not usually the way we see it happen in our society, is it? Most of the time, people build their own house, and then they'll help out God as long as they have time and nothing better to do. Not always. And I hate to put it that way, but sometimes that's the reality. Once again, the actions always show the intents of the heart. You know, what you believe is always shown in the actions. And so what they believed was that God's house was important. They put their max effort into it, max builders, best materials they could get. And then when it was time, they went back home and he built his own house. I want to read to you from the prophet Haggai. If you want to turn there with me, it's in the New Testament. He is one of the minor prophets. Haggai was one of the prophets that came to Israel. Oh, I went too far. He's one of the prophets that came to Israel to basically, sorry guys, I went the wrong way. To basically come to the people to tell them that what they were doing in their life was not good. They had come back into the land after their Babylonian exile. This is much later after the kings. They spent 70 years in Babylon as a consequence of constantly forsaking God. The Babylonians came in. They destroy Solomon's temple. They completely obliterate it. The people are gone as a judgment for 70 years. And then under Nehemiah, they come back into the land. And then Ezra the priest brings another contingent back in the land. And during that time, apparently, they ran into a little bit of hardship and they stopped trying to build the things of the Lord. And so Haggai is the prophet that comes to them to speak to them. And it says here in Haggai verse 1, in the second year of King Darius in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, thus speak to the Lord of hosts, saying, this people says, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house shall be built. Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses and this temple to lie in ruins? In other words, the people were building their own homes and living lavish lifestyle while the temple was laying in ruins. And so it really showed where their priorities were at. This is what Haggai's calling them out. And look at what he says in verse 5. Now, therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. In other words, think about what you're doing. You have sown much and bring in little. You eat, but you don't have enough. You drink, but you are not filled with drink. You clothe yourself, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages to put them into a bag of holes. What is God saying there? He is saying that basically, because you're not paying any attention to the things of the Lord, I'm not blessing your life. You're taking care of yourself and not the things of the Lord. Therefore, take care of yourself. You never have enough food. You never have enough wages. You put the money into bags with holes. Basically, you're losing everything because you're focused on yourselves. They were building their own homes and not the temple. And this is why when we get to 1 Kings and we look at chapter 7, we see Solomon did it the right way. Was there anything wrong with him having a nice house? Nope. As long as he took care of the things of the Lord first. And then he began to build his own house. So please don't accuse me of trying to bang the drum for money on this. I'm really not. I just really feel that as I'm going through this, I'm like, man, this might really sound like you're really trying to get to the things of money. We go verse by verse in this church, and one of the reasons we do that is so that you can look at this and say, well, this is where we're at in Scripture, and this is it. Have I justified it enough? Good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for helping me. Now let's read the rest of this chapter. Verse 9. And all these were of costly stones, cut to size, trimmed with saws, inside and out, from the foundation of the eaves and also on the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, large stones, some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. So we're talking 30 feet long. These are the ones I'm talking about, to the size of a bus. The great court was enclosed with 3 rows of hewn stones and a row of cedar beams. So were the inner court and the house of the Lord and the vestibule to the temple. Now King Solomon sent and brought Huram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a bronze worker. He was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill in working with all kinds of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon and did all his work. Now, we're sort of just going back and reviewing a lot of the things that he built. This Huram from Tyre apparently was the best worker around. So if you want work done on your house, you're going to hire the best contractor, right? Basically, this guy knew how to build everything, and he was the best guy. And so Solomon sent for him, and he brought him in. It says, and he cast 2 pillars of bronze, each one 18 cubits high, and a line of 12 cubits measure the circumference of each. And he made 2 capitals cast bronze, set them on tops of the pillars. The height of one capital was 5 cubits. The height of the other capital was 5 cubits. And he made a lattice work with wreaths and chain work for the capitals which were on top of the pillars, 7 chains for one capital and 7 for the other. So he made the pillars and 2 rows of pomegranates above the network all around to cover the capitals that were on the top. And thus he did for the other capital. The capitals which were on top of the pillars in the hall were in the shape of lilies, 4 cubits. Those are massive flowers. The capitals on the 2 pillars also had pomegranates above by convex surface, which was next to the network, and there were 200 such pomegranates in a row on each of the capitals all around. Then he set up by pillars the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the right and called its name Yakin, and he set up the pillar on the left and called its name Boaz. So these massive pillars that you saw when you came to the temple were bronze and huge. And they were so big and they stuck out so much to the people who walked up there, they named them. And Joaquin and Boaz translate into the Lord is our strength. The Lord is our strength. And this was kind of a reminder to everyone in Israel who came up there and every king that was to succeed Solomon that our strength comes from the Lord. Going back to that first point where God says, obey me and my presence will be with you. Disregard my commandments, my presence will not be with you. You're going to have a lot of problems. This is not going to work well for you. And so they set up these massive pillars as a reminder to everybody. Verse 23, and he made the sea of cast bronze, 10 cubits from the brim to the other. It was completely round. Its height was 5 cubits, and a line of cubits measured its circumference. Below its brim were ornament buds encircling it all around, 10 to a cubit, all the way around the sea. The ornamental buds were cast in rows when it was cast. And it stood on 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, 3 looking toward the west, 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east. The sea was also set upon them, and all their back parts pointed inward. So this massive looked like a swimming pool. It was 11,500 gallons, roughly. It stood on the backs of these oxen that faced the northeast, south, and west, and it was for ceremonial rinsing, and it was just basically for water on site. So, but it was massive. It was bronze. So this looks pretty cool. Verse 27, he also made 10 carts of bronze. 4 cubits was the length of each cart, 4 cubits its width, and 3 cubits its height. And this was the design of the carts. They had panels, and the panels were between the frames. And on the panels, they were between the frames, were lions, oxen, and cherubim. And on the frames with a pedestal on top. Below the lions and oxen were wreaths of plated work. Every cart had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and its 4 feet it supports. Under the laver were supports of cast bronze, each beside each wreath. Its opening on the inside crown at the top was 1 cubit in diameter, and the opening was round, shaped like a pedestal, 1.5 cubits in outside diameter, and also on the openings were engravings, but the panels were square, not round. Under the panels were the 4 wheels, and the axles of the wheels were joined to the cart. The highest of the wheel was 1.5 cubits. The workmanship of the wheels was like the workmanship of a chariot wheel. Their axle pins, their rims, their spokes, their hubs were all cast bronze. And these were their supports. Now, I'm just going to stop there because he goes on, talks about the supports, he talks about the rest of the utensils, and all of the things that David had made, he brought in. And so it says in verse 51 of chapter 7, so all the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things which his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings. He put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So once again, this is now the height of the nation of Israel. They have built now the temple of God. It is massive. It is awesome. They've got a king who is wiser than any man who's ever come before him and will ever come after him. Nations were coming there for their blessings, to talk to him, to receive advice on things, and the country was super rich and super wealthy. Now, can they hold on to it? Well, it remains to be seen. We will continue our verse-by-verse study next week in chapter 8. Remember, though, when we're building the house of the Lord, obedience is better than sacrifice. We always give our God our best because he is worthy and deserves it. And we build God's house first and then look to our own. Let's pray.